All of these paints claim to be all-in-one paints, but we're gonna put them to the ultimate side-by-side test to see which of the paints really hold up to this claim. I tested 12 of the most popular brands of all-in-one paints. I used them side by side and compared application, finish, durability, and cost to figure out which ones really are the best. In this video, I'll break down the winners and the losers for each of those categories, and then at the end, I will share the top brands of all-in-one paint and the brands of all-in-one paint that I will never buy again. If you paint furniture or you're thinking about painting furniture, you're gonna wanna watch this.
I bought 2 large tables from the thrift store and cleaned them up with TSP Substitute, which is my favorite degreasing cleaner for furniture and cabinets.
All-in-one paint is a type of paint that markets itself as having a primer and a top coat built in. So essentially, you don't need to do anything to prep your piece or to finish your piece. All you need to do is use this paint.
To test this out, I sanded down one of the tables with 220 grit sandpaper and left the other one as is with the original finish. We're going to see if these paints can hold on to both of the surfaces and don't actually need prep, which is what they claim.
Now, I've seen plenty of people use a brand of paint and then make claims about it, saying it's the best or worst. And they might be right, but it's really hard to compare all the factors of paints without doing side-by-side tests. Now, I sort of think this is fun, and I did a cabinet paint test using the top brands of alkyd enamel paint. You can see that linked up above, because I think there is real value to testing these paints at the same time right next to each other.
If you're a DIYer who thinks side-by-side tests are just as fun as I do, you should definitely subscribe. We're testing Country Chic all-in-one decor paint, General Finishes milk paint, Fusion mineral paint, Beyond all-in-one paint, Heirloom Traditions all-in-one paint, Folk Art One Paint, which you'll find at many craft stores, Silk Mineral All-in-One Paint, Rethunk Junk Resin Paint, Melange One Paint, Amy Howard at Home One Step Paint, Decor Art Your Home Paint, and Rainbow the One Paint.
I think you'll be surprised to see that some of the most popular and expensive brands of all-in-one paint did not perform as well as some of the others in this side-by-side test. I sort of wonder if some of these all-in-one paint companies are watching this and wondering, what is she gonna say about my paint? And I think it's time we find out.
When testing application of the paint, I'm looking at the consistency first, just making sure it's not way too thick or way too thin. And then I'm also looking at how well it applies to the surface with brushing and rolling. For brushing, I'm looking for a paint that glides nicely off the brush without any drag. And I'm also looking for a longer open time. So that means if I paint a stroke on my piece and then come back even a minute or two later, I want my brush to still glide through without feeling any drag. This usually means that the paint is going to level well and you're not going to see as many brush strokes. I'm also looking for a paint that rolls on nicely. Now, I tested a foam roller, a mohair roller, and a 1/4-inch woven roller on all these all-in-one paints and found that the foam roller applied the best for all of them. All right, let's look at the winners and the losers in this application category. First, we'll quickly look at the consistency of the paint. There were 2 paints that were extremely thin compared to the others. These were Beyond all-in-one paint and Amy Howard one-step paint. On the other hand, 2 paints were extremely thick, almost gloppy as they came out of the bottles. These were Folk Art One Paint and Deco Art Your Home Paint. But consistency doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a bad or good paint, so we've got to keep going. Overall, most of the paints applied really beautifully. There was minimal brush dragging, the paint rolled on nicely, and most of them were really easy to paint with. That's one of the great things about all-in-one paint. They're generally really easy to work with, but there were a few paints that did not apply easily. Let's start with rolling. Beyond all-in-one paint was awful to roll. Now, the can does say that you should use a woven roller, so I made sure to test that along with a foam roller, and no matter what I tried, the paint rolled on in a very patchy way, and it's not just because it's a lighter color. There was another paint that rolled on in a strange, patchy way with uneven coverage, and that was Folk Art One Paint. Interestingly enough, the thinnest and the thickest paints both had the worst rolling. For brushing, all of the paints brushed on really well, but there were a few that had some brush drag and a shorter open time. Amy Howard at Home had brush drag almost right away and also had a pretty short open time where I couldn't go back over the paint without feeling even more brush drag. Country Chic had a fairly short open time, but that's pretty typical for chalky paints. And Decor Art Your Home Paint also had a slightly shorter open time, but it still brushed on pretty well. Now let's get up close and personal with the finish of these paints. We're going to look at the levels of sheen, and then we're also going to look at how smooth each one finished with rolling and with brushing. Country Chic is the most matte of all of these paints. It does not have any shine, and it does feel chalky to the touch, which I guess makes sense because it is a chalk style all-in-one paint. Fusion and Silk have a slight sheen, but they are still very, very matte. Your Home, Amy Howard, and Melange have a slightly more sheen, kind of, I would say, like an eggshell finish. Rethunk Junk, Heirloom, Beyond, and General Finishes have a bit more shine, but they're still not super shiny. I would still say like an eggshell. And Rainbow One and Folk Art One have more of a shine, similar to a satin paint. Just a quick note, the one paint does come in different sheens. I tested the satin finish, but there's also a matte and a gloss as well. Let's look at the finishes on these paints, the worst and the best when rolled. There were 3 paints that had the most stipple marks when rolled, no matter which roller I used. Those paints were Beyond, Fusion, and Amy Howard. There were 4 paints that leveled beautifully when they were rolled. These were Melange, The One, Your Home, and General Finishes. All of these paints left a super smooth finish with almost no stipple marks. Now let's look at the worst and the best finish when brushing. Amy Howard at Home performed the worst for brush strokes. You could see them and you could feel them after the paint dried. Country Chic and Beyond paint were slightly better, but you could still see and feel some of the brush strokes, but they weren't quite as bad as Amy Howard. Rethunk Junk paint also did show some brush strokes, not quite as bad as the first 3, but not as good as the others. There were 4 paints that finished the best when they were brushed. They leveled well with very, very few brush strokes. These paints were Folk Art One paint, which is interesting because this paint is so thick, but it did level really well when brushed. Rainbow One paint also leveled very well. Melange One paint finished nicely when brushing, as did General Finishes Milk paint. So if you're comparing across categories to find the smoothest paints for both brushing and rolling, the 3 winners were General Finishes, Melange One paint, and Rainbow the One paint. Now let's test the durability of these finishes with a scratch test and a water test. I let the first coat of paint cure for 30 days and then tried to scratch off the finish with my fingernail and a screwdriver on both the sanded and unsanded table. I was super surprised that I was unable to scratch away any of the paint with my fingernail on the sanded or the unsanded table for any of these paints. They held on really well and the surface really didn't need to be prepped beforehand. Now, when I got out the screwdriver, I was able to scratch away the paint for all of them, but I actually think I was scratching off the original layer of finish on the table, so the paint was sticking to that layer and then I was scratching that. So to really test the adhesion of these paints, I painted 1 coat of each paint on a piece of porcelain tile, let it cure for 30 days, and then put that to the scratch test. There were 4 paints that just couldn't hold on to that tile. Silk came off the easiest, as did Amy Howard at Home paint. Melange also came off, it held on a little bit more, and Country Chic eventually came off, but it did take a lot more scratching. Now, I wouldn't call this a deal breaker if you're just planning to paint furniture, because remember, all the paints held on really well to both the sanded and unsanded wood. Here's Melange, Silk, Amy Howard, and Country Chic, all passing that scratch test on the furniture. Now, although none of the paints scratched off the furniture, almost all of the paint scuffed quite a bit with just my fingernail. And this is why I think all-in-one paints really aren't that great, because most of them really do need a top coat to be as durable as they really should be for a piece of furniture. Now, 2 paints didn't scuff very much at all. Those were General Finishes Milk paint and Melange One paint. Next up is the water test. I put a droplet of water on each paint and let it sit for an hour. After coming back, you can see that 3 paints could not hold that water in place and it started spreading. After I dried up the water, all 3 of those paints still have a large watermark in the place where the water spread to. Those paints were Country Chic, Amy Howard at Home, and Folk Art One paint. The final thing left to compare before we determine the ultimate winners and losers in this test is to look at the cost. I calculated the average cost per ounce based on a quart of paint. The least expensive paints were Rainbow the One, Folk Art One, and Amy Howard. In the next group were Silk, Melange, Rethunk Junk, Heirloom, and Country Chic paint. General Finishes milk paint was slightly higher, but still not quite as expensive as Fusion, Beyond Paint, and DecoArt Your Home paint. And finally, it's time to break down the winners and losers in this side-by-side test. Let's start with the paints that I will never buy again, and I would recommend you don't buy either for painting furniture or cabinets. Amy Howard at Home was one of the worst paints out of the 12, primarily because of the application and the finish. The paint just dried to a texture when both rolled and brushed, and personally, when I'm painting furniture and cabinets, I want a super smooth finish. Plus, it didn't hold up to the scratch test on the tile and came off really easily. Now, it did hold on to the sanded and unsanded wood, so I do think the durability is fine for a piece of furniture, but this is still something to consider. Also, there was brush dragging almost immediately, which just makes it not super easy to paint with. Now, the benefits are it is one of the cheapest paints, and it does come in 56 colors, so that is nice for the variety of colors, but there are other ones that come in more colors that give a better finish, and although you may pay a little more money, it'll be worth it. Speaking of spending a little more money, if you buy Beyond Paint, you will be buying one of the most expensive brands and getting one of the worst brands of all of these all-in-one paints. Beyond was my number one loser in this side-by-side test. Let me break down why. First, it has a really strong smell, stronger than any of the other paints, and it definitely smells like chemicals. It has a strange application. It even recommends that you don't brush it, but sometimes you're going to need to brush on a project. Even when I rolled it with the woven roller that was suggested, it's still covered in sort of a patchy way, and it needed more coats than any of the other paints. Plus, it does not dry to a smooth finish at all. It has a textured finish on both rolled and brushed surfaces. I even looked at the sample door at the hardware store and found the same thing to be true. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of reviews say that this paint is really gloppy, and I actually bought 2 more cans of it at the end of 2024 just to be sure that my first can wasn't an off can. And they were all super thin, just like I showed in the beginning of the video. To top it all off, you're going to pay a super high price for all of these negative issues. It's the second most expensive of all these brands. The redeeming quality of this paint is the adhesion. It held on really well to the tile, even after only a 24-hour dry time. But remember, there were 8 other paints that also held on to the tile, so I would not make this a factor when deciding to buy this paint. In fact, I'm going to straight up recommend that you don't buy this paint. Now that we have the losers out of the way, let's check out the winners. There were 4 paints that performed the best when considering all the factors I tested. Now, each one has slightly different pros and cons, but each of these paints is really great and you can't go wrong with any of them. If you're looking for paint you can use on a smaller project or one you can buy from craft stores like Joann and Michael's, DecoArt Your Home performed really well, and I was pretty surprised. It applied well, it leveled well, and it was durable even on the tile. Now, it costs more and is only sold in these pints, so it wouldn't work for a larger project, but it is still pretty good paint. Melange made it into this winner's bracket primarily because of the super smooth application and finish. It leveled beautifully when both brushed and rolled, and it was one of the only paints where the finish didn't scuff easily when I scratched it with my fingernail. It feels like most of these all-in-one paints actually need a top coat to be durable, except for Melange and my next 2 winning paints. Another benefit is that there's over 100 colors to choose from this company, which is the highest of any of these all-in-one paints. However, you'll have to order directly from the company or find a small retailer near you that carries it, and this of course will make it a little more expensive because of shipping. Finally, it's important to remember that this paint did not hold up to the scratch test on the tile. It's holding on perfectly fine to both the sanded and unsanded wood, but if you're planning to use it, I would probably scuff sand my wood surfaces, especially if it's a glossy finish and I want to use this paint. The next winner is one that I had never even heard of before researching paints to include in this side-by-side test. Rainbow the One paint is sold on Amazon and it came out on top primarily because of how beautifully smooth the finish turned out when both brushed and rolled. It's one of the only all-in-one paints that is sold in different sheens. It comes in matte, satin, and gloss. I used the satin for my test, and the finish looked really nice with a slight sheen at the end. It held onto the tile under my scratch test, even after only a 24-hour cure time. And best of all, it is the cheapest of all of these brands of paint. So you might be wondering, why is it not my top choice? And that's primarily because it only comes in 13 color options. Of course, you could do some custom mixing, but when you only have 13 colors to choose from, your options are pretty limited. All in all, this is a great paint that I can confidently recommend as long as you can find a color you like. The overall winner in this side-by-side test was General Finishes Milk Paint. Now, interestingly enough, this paint has been around longer than most of these other brands of paints, but it never has marketed itself as an all-in-one paint that you see slapped on so many new products today. But it really does perform that way. Just a quick note, it's not actually milk paint at all. If you're wondering about milk paint, check out this video linked above. All right, let's look at what made this paint the winner. First, it's beautiful to apply. It's easy to work with, there's no brush dragging, and it applies nicely when both brushed and rolled. It also dries to a smooth, level finish no matter how you apply it. And that finish is pretty durable. When I did my scratch test with my fingernail, it was only one of two paints that didn't really scuff with my fingernail scratch. Plus, it held on to the tile in my scratch test. Now, I will say this paint does need longer to cure than some of the other all-in-one paints. After 24 hours, it did scratch off some from the tile, but then after a full week, it was completely cured and held on well to that tile. So if you're using this paint, just be aware that it does have a slightly longer cure time. Also, this paint is readily available in 28 colors on Amazon, or you can get it custom color tinted at many paint stores that carry the paint. Go online to General Finishes website and you can look up what locations do that custom tinting. The only downside to this paint could be the cost. It's definitely not the cheapest of all the options, but it's also not the most expensive. So I definitely recommend spending a little more money to get a high quality product. This paint is really awesome.
Now, if you've used any of these brands of paint and would like to share in the comments your own experience, please do. It helps me and it helps readers. Better believe I have to run a side-by-side test of some of these top all-in-one paints compared to the top acrylic alkyd paints that I did in my other side-by-side test. I'll make sure to post that video as soon as it's done.